We're going to get started. Kyle just walked in, so we can begin. Alright. I definitely don't want to be up there, so can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. In the back? Alright, awesome. So, thanks for coming. This talk is mostly about Tolkien and a little bit about cyber, but I'm going to convince you that it's a lot more about cyber than you think it is right now. And we'll talk about what that means for the life of a CISO. Mike, how do you pronounce it?
CISO.
CISO. All right. It's the official coming from the CISO. All right. So first off, the obligatory thank you everyone for everything that you've done to make this conference possible. Thank you to the organizers, volunteers, the people that funded it. I know how much this tier costs. I don't know about the other ones, but that's still a pretty good chunk of change. So thank you to them. And with that, we will get on with the show. So who am I? That guy if I'm lucky, but that's just AI doing really awesome work. That's me. So Chris Tino, I'm the Director of Detection, Analysis, and Response at Fifth Third Bank. We call that team DART. A lot of those folks are in the room, so thank you for keeping the bank safe today. Primarily, I'm a husband and a father of two. I have two wonderful boys. From a background perspective, because I know there are students here, I have a degree in electrical engineering from Ohio University, specializing on the computer engineering side, so CS kind of world. I'm an AV wannabe. I love to mess with sound equipment. I don't actually record anything. I don't have a podcast, despite the mic that you might see me on with Zoom. I don't have a cis white guy podcast that I'm doing. I am an occasional disc golfer, and coffee. Yes, all things coffee. So now, back to the whole point of the talk. Tolkien would have been a great CISO, sorry, Mike. The subtext of this is building an understanding through storytelling. If you know anything about Tolkien, which I know some of you don't, and some of you probably know well more than I do, Tolkien was a storyteller. Tolkien was a linguist. He was a lot of different things. So let's talk about that. J.R.R. Tolkien was born in January of 1892. That was the same year, to give you context, that Ellis Island first started having immigration come through into the United States. 6 years prior, the first Mercedes-Benz was ever made, the first gas-powered car ever. So this is the time that Tolkien lived in. Not a ton of technology, but starting to build up. Tolkien was primarily known as an author. The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, a whole bunch of letters that now people go through to figure out what his life was like and get into his thought process. Also, Tolkien was a linguist. If you've ever read or spoken Elven, guess what? He invented it purely himself. He also invented other languages, not Klingon, but he was a linguist. He loved language. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute. He was a professor. So Tolkien, we'll talk about his time at war in just a minute. But Tolkien got his degree from Oxford, and after coming back from war in World War I, he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon English literature at Oxford. He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon from 1925 to 1945. 20 years teaching Anglo-Saxon? I mean, this guy was deep. He was very deep in what he did and what he loved. He was an influencer as well. This one, if you think about, I don't mean like social media, I'm on LinkedIn or X or Twitter or whatever influencer. I mean face-to-face conversation, building relationships type of influencer. The things that he did while he was at Oxford, he was one of the primary members of a group called the Inklings. C.S. Lewis was another primary member of this group. He was an influencer to the degree that Tolkien, being a devout Roman Catholic, after C.S. Lewis in his youth fled away from Christianity, Tolkien was the one that brought him back. Not as a Roman Catholic, because C.S. Lewis didn't like papists, but that's the type of influencing power that Tolkien had on people. And in those meetings of the Inklings, they would talk about literature, they'd talk about prose and poetry, and they would make works together. They would influence each other on the craft that they did every single day. He was also a father. He had 4 children. The most well-known probably is Christopher Tolkien, because of the work that he's done to posthumously write a lot of Tolkien's original works that were never published. But he had 3 sons and a daughter. So he actually wrote The Hobbit primarily as a children's story. He was also a veteran. This one to me, not being a veteran, not really coming from a strong family of veterans, but this one to me is important because it shapes a lot of what you hear in his subsequent works that he wrote. He was in World War I. He was in the Battle of Somme in 1916. The Battle of Somme was one of the most brutal battles of World War I for the British. There were a total between the British and French and others in that region, over 600,000 casualties in that war. Tolkien was in the trenches with his friends and saw 2 of his closest friends die in that war. So from a background perspective, Tolkien had a lot of things to influence himself early on. As I said, he was born in 1892, this was in 1916. He had just gotten his degree from Oxford in like July of that year, or a few years prior rather, and then gone off to war. Immediately applied and went. He was then injured like 5 months in, trench fever or something along those lines, and had to ship home. Tried to get back in several times, was said, "You are unfit to serve, sir." So this was the world that he lived in. So what on earth does that have to do with anything that you're here to talk about today? Well, honestly, not a lot, because he's still not a CISO. But let's talk about some more things in his lifetime that kind of go in with our work. So 1937, Tolkien writes The Hobbit, publishes The Hobbit. This is the same year that the first programmable computer ever shows up. It's the Z1. This was giant. It weighed about a ton. And this is a recreation of it on the side. You can't really see it, but had over 20,000 components in it. That's a pretty cool piece of tech. At the end of his life, in 1973, this is when TCP and Ethernet show up from Palo Alto. Invented out in the Xerox Park in Palo Alto by Robert Metcalfe and David Boggs. So Tolkien's life didn't have a lot to do with technology, had a ton to do with some things that CISOs do really well if they're good at the role. Influencing, strong background in what they do, strong technical depth, but also breadth and influence, and some really good war stories to tell. If anyone's ever been a part of a cybersecurity incident, the parts that you remember the most are when you were in the trenches with all the people around you, stopping the bad guy, I hope, or at least minimizing the damage that they're going to do. So why does this matter? When we talk about the art of being a CISO, or the art of being a security analyst and making that work meaningful, the most difficult part is taking like the lexicon that we have of bits and bytes and events and malware and threat actors and families, and making that make sense to anyone else that doesn't do it every day. How do you get budget if you can't explain that? How do you form a team if you don't know how to influence people and see them work well together when it really matters? One of the things that Tolkien said, which I thought was really interesting when I found this out about 4 or 5 years ago, is that I mentioned he was a linguist first. He loved language so much that the stories that he told were actually just a world for the language to live in. Think about that for a minute. Like the language that you live in every day, if you're an analyst or an architect or a GRC or you're not in any of these things and you're just a passerby, but think about the language of cybersecurity. And think about being so passionate about that you're like, all right, I gotta tell some stories about this because this is really cool. That starts to resonate, I think, with some of us, especially with folks that have been doing it for a while and have seen some of these things. As a CISO, this becomes vital to your success. As a CISO presenting to your board of directors, this becomes vital to your presence in the company in the long term, especially when things get rough. Do they trust what you're saying? Do they believe in your story? Or is it up for interpretation? Because you don't tell that great of a story. You've got a lexicon, you've got a language, you've got a story around it. This is the difference, in my mind, about what makes a security team, and by extension, the people that lead those security teams great, is the stories that they're able to tell from the work that they do day in and day out. Excuse me, just a second. So a name comes first, right? Name comes first, and then the story will follow. All right, let's talk about some names. This is an interactive portion of the presentation. So if you recognize the story that Tolkien is trying to tell and the name that goes along with it from a cyber perspective, think big vulnerabilities, big events over the last 4-ish years, just shout it, all right? So the first one, ring rates. Anybody think of a big vulnerability or a big cyber event that happened? This is the first one. I'll help you. Spectre. You remember Spectre? All right. So there's one. I apologize. You probably can't see these very well. When Frodo was pierced by the Morgul blade, I wasn't quite there. Close though. Heartbleed. All right. Now we got some players. Heartbleed. I'm lost. Throwing the ring into Mount Doom. Career limiting move. Meltdown. Have a meltdown? All right. Shelob. You gotta know what Shelob is. Paralyzing Frodo. This is in Return of the King. Shelob was a spider, scatter spider. Alright. This one, we're starting to get fun with these. This is Frodo and Sam's entire relationship during the Return of the King. Not red team, blue team. Code of it. Yeah. Look at the picture. WannaCry. Next one. This one takes a bit. I'm going to switch sides. The resource that you go to see what's happened that then turns on you so much that you need to lock him in his tower and make sure that nobody can interact with him. There's a lot of these, but it's long for J. Alright. This next one is my favorite, and how this hasn't actually materialized into an ad campaign I don't know. Because this one is probably the best. Right here. This is the biggest walking advertisement for Akamai out of all of fantasy literature. Gandalf on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, holding off the Balrog, however you want to say it. I mean, come on, if this isn't Akamai right here. Akamai is so good at this, and this is not a promotion, this is more the fact that you'll notice a lot of these are AI-generated pictures. Well, not this one. I tried to fill out their brand, request. I got a 404 as soon as I went to it. They are that damn good. So getting back to the serious topic at hand. Tolkien told a lot of stories. As we saw in his history, he wasn't around when technology was around, but he was really good at storytelling, and he probably could have come up with a whole bunch of those names that we just rattled off. But who's writing your story? In your company today, if you were to ask yourself, who is writing the story of what you do every single day? Is it you? Or is it stuff like what's on the screen? Your CIO goes out the bleeping computer and says, holy shit, look at what happened. Did that happen to us? Guess what the rest of your day or week is going to be filled with? You didn't write that story. Someone else wrote it and you responded. You might have read it, but not before your CIO, unfortunately. Now you're brushing up on the Cliff Notes. These types of interactions are what end up driving so many companies and so many security teams when they aren't the ones that are writing their story. And some of this is going to happen regardless. You can't control this, especially nowadays. It used to be a lot easier. But you can't control this world. I mean, my favorite one that just popped out, this one you can't see, but this is VX Underground sharing the post about the folks ratting out the company that they just ransomed to the SEC. That's a crap story to read, isn't it? But this is where the rubber really meets the road for me in the idea of a CISO and a security team. Is that in order to get good at what you're doing and to continue to have success, you have to be the one controlling the narrative. You've got the language, you've got the skill set, you've got all these great tools, you've got all these great alerts, wonderful, dandy, you've got metrics. No one really cares to change their mind unless you can write a story that is compelling enough, a narrative that is compelling enough to make them do it. I'll give you two prime examples of this. One from 2018 and one from just this week. 2018, cyber insurance provider comes in, the company I was at the time. I didn't meet with them, thank God. But our CISO had to meet with them and basically defend our team to someone that knows nothing about us, knows nothing really about the industry, but is going to give us money in case something happens, and wants to make sure that we're adequate enough that they're not going to have to cash out in a week. So how do they do it? They get a checklist. They say, do you do this? Do you do this? Do you have these products? And they list every single possible thing at the time. Do you have an EDR? Do you have an AV solution? Do you have firewalls? They don't ask if they have an ACL on them. They just say, do you have firewalls? But that's the level that they're at. Our CISO at the time didn't play into that game. Sure, he answered the questions, but he answered them in a way that he then told them a story about what we had been working on for the past year or two. By the end of the conversation, they had the realization that they had been measuring risk in cybersecurity all wrong. And they lowered the premium. That's a story I'd like to write. Next example from this week. Tech committee of the board is meeting. And typically, the way our order has gone is that the main board meeting happens, you present all the metrics, and then the tech committee meets afterwards, and you have to present the same thing. So you present the metrics again, and they ask about the numbers and why they are the way they are. You got a stupid number that it's board metrics, and you have to talk to them. You have to let them tell your story for you. This time, for whatever reason, they flipped the order. So the tech committee was first. Said, all right, well, crap, the board hasn't seen these numbers yet. Do we really want to show them now? Well, no, let's come up with a different plan. So they had to put together a story of what we were working on and how awesome it was. The result was the CIO saying, you all rocked it. The board agreeing with him. And at the end of the day, they didn't have to talk about just numbers. They got to actually tell a story. So the difference here is if you're able to grab those moments, or better yet, create those moments for yourself in your organization, whether you're the CISO or whether you're just a security analyst, have this in mind. What did I do today that was worth a bit of narrative? You don't need to write a poem about it, but maybe an acrostic. But grab that stuff and hang on to it and use that when you're talking about what did I do this week? What did I do this month? At the end of the year, what were my goals? How did I achieve them? I saved the company $50,000. Cool. Tell me a story. That's the idea. So, how does this relate back? One of the things that Tolkien said, like I said, dude loved language, keep this in mind. He found a Finnish grammar book. So Tolkien was English, so Finland's not too far. Found a Finnish grammar book. And he said that it was like discovering this wine cellar full of all these wines that nobody had ever tasted, of flavors that no one had ever seen before. It intoxicated him. If you can tell a story like that and get your board or your CIO or whoever intoxicated about what you do, damn, you are succeeding. That's awesome. That's success. And keep in mind, if you're doing this well, and back to why do I think Tolkien was a great potential CISO before his time, it's for this reason. Fantasy literature, which he's most well known for, existed before he ever started writing it. But he defined the entire genre for millions of people around the world. The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, to all but maybe a couple people in this room, are very well known. You think of fantasy writing, you think of those. And everyone else after him took something that he gave with them. He was an influencer. So, in this world, this is why I would say Tolkien was a hell of a lot more than a CISO than you think, because of his ability to take something that no one else would find interesting, in words that no one else understands, and make so many people fall in love with it because of how he wrote his stories. And that, to me, is the goal of a CISO, is to be able to do that for their team and their organization to be successful then and into the future. And with that,